And this morning at the Conservative conference here in Blackpool, we shall have the big debate on economic policy, when it's assumed that we shall get some guidance on the party's alternatives to the government's present methods of dealing with inflation. The actual motion to be debated doesn't give much of a hint. As I mentioned earlier in the programme, it just calls for the control of inflation, the stimulation of growth, and the creation of a new social climate which rewards hard work and enterprise. It does not, of course, say how this should be achieved. Well, that's left to the Shadow Chancellor, Sir Geoffrey Howe, who will reply to the debate, and who's with me now. Sir Geoffrey, I was talking to Mr. Ducan a little earlier, who hopes to speak in the debate. It was his view that at this stage we should not actually hear policies, but only discussions on what might go into those policies. Do you share that view?
Well, we shall have discussions about a lot of detailed points that people would want us to consider. I think we shall also have very clearly stated from the floor and from the platform what the central policies are. I think there's a tendency for people nowadays to say, look, you haven't got a policy unless you're going to produce a long list of new laws you're going to pass. We've got too many laws. We don't need a great mass of them. The solution of our problems now depends upon some very simple propositions. Inflation is rising and high, unemployment is rising and high, because government is spending too much, because we're being too heavily taxed. And we've got to get that central message across. We've got to argue the case for getting government out of our hair, getting taxes down, giving people the chance to get ahead for themselves, to save some money, to invest, to create jobs for other people. Simple, essential messages.
Well, messages which obviously don't get agreement in the Labour Party, and we were hearing them last week attacking this policy of cutting government expenditure because, among other things, it would lead to greater unemployment. Now, what is the...
No, that's exactly wrong, you see. At the present, Dennis Healey is spending £20 billion a year more than we were spending in our last year of government. Now, that can only come from high taxes, and high taxes heaped upon those we've got already are making it impossible for businesses to make profits. If you can't make profits, you've got no money to save and no money to invest. That means that new jobs are not being created. So the two policies march together. You can't go on inventing money, spending it as though it's going out of fashion, pretending it doesn't come from the pockets of the ordinary people of this country. And if you squeeze them so hard, then there is no money left to invest. It's as simple as that.
Well, surely their key argument, I'd be interested to know your answer to it, is that at the moment they have got this social contract, which they say, and said over and over again last week, is working. And what do you suggest is an alternative to the arrangements that they have made?
Well, strangely enough, the social contract was scarcely mentioned last week as such, because it was the social contract which, in fact, has helped to generate this huge inflation. What happened a year ago was that they came into office saying, don't worry, boys, we've got this magic cure that will solve everything this side of eternity, the social contract. Result, every inflationary wage claim was able to find a loophole in the social contract. Public sector wages went soaring up. Jobs, they began competing against the private sector. Wages everywhere else went up. And the social contract really has now been discarded.
Well, I think we're talking about two different social contracts. I probably didn't make myself clear. I mean, the current social contract, Mark II, which involves the £6 a week pay.
I see. Well, they've been driven to resort to that as a result of the failure of the policies on which they were elected. They were elected on the basis of deception. They said that we can cure everything in this magical way, and went spending money as though it was going out of fashion. It's that which pushed up wages throughout the economy. It's that which pushed up prices throughout the economy. And now, of course, they've had to resort to a desperate measure, which they say they'll have to rely on for only a year. But the underlying malaise is remaining the same. But too much spending, yes, too much taxes, means higher prices, fewer jobs.
But even allowing for how it happened, the situation is with us. They are taking this action to deal with it. What better action could you take to deal with the situation as it is now?
Well, exactly as I've been saying. You say they're taking this action to deal with it, but the trouble is that they're not. The amount of money being spent by government month by month is almost literally out of control. That's why interest rates are going up, because government is having to borrow more. Higher interest rates again means lower investment. The situation will not be brought under control until Dennis Healey actually takes a grip of public spending. It is as simple and as central and as essential as that.
Sir Geoffrey, thank you.
16 and a half minutes past 8. Well, now, I expect you've met the chap who's got the same model car as you, but he gets about 10 miles more to the gallon out of his than you do out of yours. With fuel the price it is, MPG upmanship has become the fashion of the day. However, it seems it can well happen that two cars of exactly the same specification can differ by as much as 15 miles per gallon in consumption, even when driven by the same driver in the same way over a test run. That's just one of the findings by Motor Magazine, who say that many of the fuel consumption claims made in the advertising blurb sent out by car firms is inaccurate and misleading. They demand some form of government-supervised test for all car petrol economy claims and say that only these results should be allowed to be used in advertising. The technical editor of Motor is Anthony Curtis, and David Mellor asked him whether he could give some examples of the ways in which he felt the public were being misled.
Well, one of the main things is the habit of the use in advertising of fuel consumption figures at constant speeds. They say that the car has a fuel consumption, let's say, of 50 miles per gallon at a constant 50 miles per hour. These figures are obtained by running the car around a track when the wind is low and the track is completely flat. So the consumption you obtain is completely unrealistic. These conditions are never met, even on a motorway.
What could that 50 miles to the gallon come down to in actual fact?
Well, it could be halved in traffic. It could be even worse if you, on short journeys, in the first 5 or 6 miles of a short journey, your consumption goes down to something like 12 or 14 miles to the gallon, even in a smallish, say, 1.5 litre car.
When I first saw your article, I got on to British Leyland and I said, look here, the Motor Magazine says that a lot of these figures that are being given are inaccurate. And British Leyland came back to me and said, well, but we use those figures that Motor Magazine provide. That's where we get our information from.
Well, that's quite true. And the first thing is that we're going to withdraw our permission for our figures to be used in advertising. The point is that we have two fuel consumption figures, which means something to people who are interested in cars or who are technically minded, but don't mean enough to the ordinary member of the public. And we feel they're used in a confused and misleading way, so we're going to stop permission for them to be used in advertising.
Can you just expand on that a little bit? What are the two figures?
Well, we have what we call a touring figure, which is calculated from the sort of steady speed measurements which I've just been condemning.
This is the one that looks good.
That's the one that looks good. That is a sort of consumption that you might get if you drove gently. And then we have an overall consumption, which is the consumption that we ourselves obtain when we test a car for at least 1,000 miles. And this is a good deal worse, usually, than most people will get, simply because we drive the cars harder.
And I suppose the motor manufacturers always quote the good figure.
Well, yes, they tend to, and they also sometimes tend to muddle them up, and they tend to use figures from different sources and to compare automatic cars with manual cars and things like that.
Well, what, in your view, Mr. Curtis, ought to be done about it all?
Well, there is a method, a technique of measuring fuel consumption in a way which includes the accelerations and decelerations and so on in a completely objective way. What you do is you put the car, you drive the car in a laboratory, as it were. You put its driving wheels on a set of rollers, and it's possible to reproduce road conditions and to have the car accelerated, cruised, decelerated, idled in a rigidly prescribed routine which can be accurately repeated.
And are you suggesting that the government takes on this job?
It need not necessarily actually be done by the government, but under the government's supervision. You would know that from the high-performance car doing 14 miles to the gallon to a very small car doing 45 miles to the gallon, they were all tested in exactly the same way and in a completely objective way with no significant driver error or personal error of that sort.
And at the moment, you think the public are being misled?
I think they most certainly are, yes.
Well, that was Anthony Curtis of Motor Magazine. My car seems to cost about £1 between filling stations nowadays. Terrible business. Nearly 21 minutes past 8. And now we bring you the story of organoleptic analyst Albert Weber. Mr. Weber's been organoleptic analysing in New York for more than 30 years, and the authorities there don't want him to retire. Organoleptic analysing, well, that means sniffing food to see if it's fit to eat. Mr. Weber's just about the best food sniffer they've ever had in New York, kept his nose clean all that time, and so they've persuaded him to stay on for another year. John Sargent, whose nose can mostly be found in the air, thought it must be a simply awful job.
It is. It's a job that nobody ever volunteers for. They do it because it's part of their job.
And what are the sort of things that you have to smell?
The main thing that I do regularly is on shellfish. That's shrimp, lobster, rock lobster tails, and then all other types of fishes. Canned fishes like tuna fish or sardines. Any and every food that we handle if any decomposition is suspected. You do it by smelling.
What's the worst thing that you have to do?
The worst thing I have to do when we got fish that's what we call class 3 or worse, you can't even get close to it.
Surely there's no point in testing it. It's obviously no good.
That is true, but unfortunately, there's always somebody willing to sell it, and somebody's willing to buy it. The ones who buy it is generally, say, for instance, a cheap restaurant, and because it's low price, and he doctors it up with so much other things that the person who's not used to high-class food does not know the difference.
You mean to say that if you've smelt some pretty awful fish, it could still be legally possible to sell it?
Not legally, but if we don't know about it, if we don't sample it to stop the sale of it, somebody's going to do it.
You requested to stay on.
That's right.
But aren't you pretty fed up now with all this sniffing?
Well, not necessarily, because I work under pleasant conditions. We don't always have these real stinking products. So once in a while you resign yourself, and if it gets too bad, you walk out and leave it go and come back an hour later.
What a splendid man, New York's official food smeller, a job which at the moment, at any rate, I would be completely incapable of doing. It's 23 minutes past 8. And I have to report that we've been having a bit of an Indian summer here in Blackpool this week. Some warm sun and blue skies in contrast to the gales and storms of last week. I hasten to say there is nothing politically symbolic in that, except that I suspect a fair number of Conservatives have been lured out of that rather stuffy and, by now, I should think somewhat germ-laden conference hall to savour the delights of the sunlit Golden Mile. Which brings me, without further ado, to Kathleen Eyre, the local historian who you may remember enlivened one of our programmes last week with the story of the Winter Gardens, and who knows the history of the Golden Mile since it was only a furlong. Kathleen, tell us all about it.
Well, John, I reckon you've come about 40 years too late to see the Golden Mile at its best, which means, of course, at its worst, because really some of the most degrading spectacles ever witnessed were staged there, and there must be thousands of people who can remember queuing up to see Sacco, the fasting Dutchman, who deprived himself of nourishment for 65 days on end, and died 2 months later, poor chap. That was in the summer of 1929. Mm-hmm. And it started a mania for these human exhibitions. Individuals...
We've been having them at conferences ever since, I said. No, do carry on, sorry.
Individuals starving in barrels. You paid sixpence to peep through the bunghole. And the most notorious of the barrel squatters was the unfrocked rector of Stewkey.
In Norfolk,
yes, after that very sensational court case. And it triggered off a torrent of angry letters, you know, from irate churchmen, angry matrons, and outraged maiden ladies.
Well, they all wanted to get in the barrels as well, did they? Was that really?
Oh, they wanted to have it all stopped. And this peep show impresario was fined. Nevertheless, he bobbed back a year or two later with a new idea. Starving brides and bridegrooms. Couples were married, came fresh from the altar, climbed into bed behind glass, and you paid sixpence to queue up and see them. The end of the week, they got £100.
They weren't supposed to do anything, I imagine.
No, just lie there. That's it,
yes,
just lie there.
Must get that clear,
and in those days, £100 would furnish a small, modern, semi-detached house. And so it went on. All these excitements, terrible shows, the barkers, the smells, hamburgers and onions, candy floss, fish and chips, and perspiring humanity. Everybody going lemming-like along this few hundred yards, it wasn't a mile, of the Blackpool Promenade. And yet it all started very respectably with a prim row of 3-storey houses, overlooking the sea and with long front gardens. Whereas down on the sands, in front of the future tower site, there was a whole army of entertainers reaping a golden or at least a silver harvest on the sands. Buskers, acrobats, corn curers, oyster sellers, rock sellers, quack doctors, and one real one who'd been struck off the rolls, and an out-of-work army of music hall artists who were tiding themselves over.
Then they had to move up off the sand.
Yes, they cleaned up this glorious stretch of beach, they nipped over the prom, rented the promenade forecourts, and turned the whole thing into the Golden Mile of inglorious memory.
There now, what a wonderful story. Kathleen, thank you.
It all happens in Blackpool. 26 minutes past 8, we'll have a look at the world of sport now with Gerald Williams.
Today's the day they hope to make it all change at Crewe. Change from the time that Tottenham Hotspur beat them 13-2. We hear from Harry Gregg, Crewe's manager, as Spurs head north to play them again. A British winner, David Broom, talks about the man he beat at Wembley last night, Alvin Shokamola. Well, tonight, for the second day running, there's a chance for soccer's working class to take a pot at the aristocrats in the third round of the Football League Cup. Last night, of the 7 ties played, 4 were drawn. The 3 clubs safely into the last 16 are Hull City, Wolves and Middlesbrough. This evening among the ties to be played, there's Lincoln at Leicester and Darlington at West Ham. Crewe are more fortunate. They have a home match against Spurs. But the thought that jogs their memory is the score of the match they played back in 1960. Yes, Tottenham beat them 13-2 that day. It was the worst hiding of their life. John Aberley wondered whether the haunting statistics of that day might affect the attitude of Crewe's manager Harry Gregg as he prepares his players for tonight.
Affect my attitude? You've got to be joking. I played against that Spurs side when the Spurs club were a great club then and had a great team, and I was a great player. I'm not a great player anymore. Spurs are still a great club, but I'm sure even they wouldn't say they were a great side.
All the same, would you say that the pressure will be on Spurs?
I tell you what, the pressure's on Terry Neal, it's on Harry Gregg, it's on Phil Nicol, my centre half, it's on all the players on the pitch. But the most important thing about that pressure is I hope it's pressure with pleasure. But most important of all, I want a result in our favour.
Well, what is the magic formula, if there is one, Harry, which enables a little club like Crewe to beat one of the big boys?
There's no magic formula. It's like football itself. There's no blueprint for success. Ability is the most important thing, but allied to that ability is honesty and the will to win. I've got players now that I believe that they believe in themselves. I believe in them, and I think now that they're starting to believe in themselves. That is the most important thing.
We'll be keeping an eye on tonight's matches and reporting progress in Soccer Special. That's on Radio 2, 1500 metres, beginning at just after 8 o'clock, and there'll be live commentary on one of the ties. At the Empire Pool Wembley last night, it was Britain's David Broom all the way in the Phillips Electrical Championship at the Horse of the Year show. Well, not exactly all the way, but almost. He finished first on Philco, and he also came third and fourth on two other horses in the jump-off. After which, I would have thought uncomfortable contortion, Derek Thompson asked Broom what his feelings were before he went into that final jump-off against the clock.
It's a terrible feeling to have that many in the jump-off because, A, you don't have many in between them, and two, you don't have much time to get any of them ready, and your mind is all split up between the three. And the worst part is, if you don't win it, everybody's got the laugh on you. You know, you're expected to win it, you've got so many chances to everybody else, and if you goof it, they're laughing, you know, and you know they're going to laugh.
You really brought the crowd to their feet tonight, and it's nice, if I can say this, to have a British winner instead of the great Alvin Shokamola. He just keeps on winning. What went wrong with him tonight?
I don't know, thank goodness he had a night off, you know, it makes a change, doesn't it?
You've finished second to him so many times, haven't you?
It's unbelievable. Philco's had so many seconds here, it's just not true, and like 4 out of 5 of them's been to Alvin Shokamola in the last 3 months, you know.
Can I ask David Broom what makes Alvin Shokamola so great?
Oh, Alvin has been a friend and a rival for 15 years now. Everything just clicks. He's a true workman at his job, you know. He's very professional in everything he does. He's an extremely talented rider. You know, the worst part is he's such a damn nice guy, you know. You can't say, oh, damn German. You can't even get annoyed about it, you know. He goes in, he beats you, and he doesn't do it through luck. He does it through sheer talent, and you have to admire it.
In Madrid, the Commercial Union Grand Prix lawn tennis tournament continues today in spite of all sorts of pressure from the politicians. Eastern Europeans like Ilina Stasi, the Yugoslavs Niki Pilic and Niki Spear, and a trio of Polish internationals as well. They've all had one instruction to withdraw as a protest over the actions of the Spanish regime and another to carry on playing. That one's come from the International Lawn Tennis Federation. The 3 young British players out there are in no such confusion, but they're out all the same. Stephen Warboys lost to Jan Kodish 7-5, 6-2, John Fever to the giant American Victor Amaya 6-3, 3-6, 10-8, and Mark Farrell to Bjorn Borg 6-2, 6-1. So now it's the turn of the old Etonian Robin Drysdale to take on Borg. Finally, to report that the sweet smell of success has hardly wafted from Bernard Gallagher's nostrils than the Dunlop Masters champion has lost to the American Forrest Fessler in the opening rounds of the golf tournament in Columbus, Ohio. Fessler finished 1 up.
The news headlines. It's 8:31 now. As more and more doctors decide to go abroad, there's yet another threat to the health service. Many junior hospital doctors say they'll do emergency work only. They're unhappy about a new overtime deal. A new extremist group in the Irish Republic has threatened to kill Rose Dugdale's baby if the Dutch industrialist is murdered. The baby has been moved to another home. The 2 men detained in Belfast in connection with the Caterham pub bombing have now been released. In Beirut, the recent lull in fighting has ended in renewed clashes between rival factions. Shells and rockets were used and fires broke out in several areas. At Blackpool, it's the second day of the Conservative Party conference, and Mr. Edward Heath is expected to be there. The weather, a mainly dry day in most areas, except in Northern Ireland and parts of Scotland, sunny spells in many places.
Well, it's always interesting to see what subject sparks off the most heated debate at a party conference, and this week it may well be electoral reform. It's a subject one associates more with Liberal assemblies generally than Conservative conferences, not normally one to rouse the passions, yet here in Blackpool we've already had some brisk exchanges between MPs at a fringe meeting on the subject, and it's expected there'll be more to come at today's debate in the conference itself. Well, Mr. Richard Kershaw, MP for Stroud, chaired that fringe meeting, and Mr. Norman Lamont, MP for Kingston-upon-Thames, who's just published a booklet opposing electoral reform, was one of the speakers there. They're both with me now. Now, Mr. Kershaw, I wonder how it is that this subject has cropped up at a Conservative conference in the first place.
Because I think it's basically unfair that the electorate should always be represented by a government they have voted against. And this is particularly at a time when the government, now elected on the smallest minority for a very long time, is doing things which are radically different to what the country as a whole wants.
Well, Mr. Lamont, what is your answer to that?
Well, our country's had a lot of very difficult economic problems in the last 2 years, but the one thing we've managed to preserve through it has been our political stability. I strongly believe that systems of proportional representation, which tend to produce multi-party systems, governments consisting of 3, 4, 5 parties, and many parties represented in Parliament, that is the road to political instability. It is the road to paralysis in government, as has been the experience in many countries. There are countries which have operated the systems with less difficulty, but in many countries it has led to political instability and led to chaos in government. And I don't think that at this time of all times that we can afford to forgo the merits of our system, which are that it provides a majority in Parliament, and creating a majority is not always an easy thing, and that it does provide stability. And our system, in our present situation, is what has stood between us and political instability.
Well, let me put that back to you. Forgive me for calling you Mr. Richard Kershaw, Mr. Anthony Kershaw. Can I put that point
as
back?
to economic difficulties, is it not perhaps something to do with the matter of electoral system that we have the greatest economic difficulties in Europe? And when Norman says paralysis in government, what country suffers in Europe from paralysis of government compared to ourselves, of the countries who are comparable to us? We do not have a government here which is able to pursue any continued policy, because each government, because of the wide gulf between the two parties, tries to reverse the legislation of its predecessor.
Well, I don't think the sort of situation you've had in Italy recently, I don't think the sort of situation you've had in Holland, where it took many months to form the present five-party government. One hears of situations in Denmark, where it's terribly difficult even to get agreement on a tax change and to get it through the legislature, because there are so many political parties represented in the parliament. That is a way to complete immobilism in your parliament. It can be a very dangerous situation, and there is no doubt that whatever system you adopt, it can lead, and the general tendency, there are exceptions, but the general tendency is clear, that proportional representation fragments the political spectrum. It splits up parties and produces a multi-party system.
Can I just toss in here the liberal argument, which one hears so often, the sheer basic argument of fair play, that is it fair for the vast number of millions of voters to have such a small representation in Parliament?
Well, fairness isn't something like redness or blueness that everybody will agree on. Every electoral system is a compromise between fairness and efficiency, which means producing a workable majority. Is it fair, if we adopted the German system, that a small party in Parliament who were holding the balance would determine who was the government? Is it fair that the choice of government should be removed from the voter who has that choice at present and transferred to the politicians within Parliament, wheeling and dealing? In one sense, proportional representation is a most undemocratic system.
The voter does not choose the government here. The very few voters who have influence on which government rules are the few voters in marginal seats. In fact, as I said before, 60%, over 60% of the voters here voted against this government. This is the government they've got, and that is the real weakness of our present system.
Gentlemen, there we must close it. We have a flavour of what we're going to hear a lot more of, I suspect, during the course of the day. And now, with the time just after 24 minutes to 9, we'll go back to London for a review of today's papers.
The Times political editor says the first day of the Conservative conference in Blackpool can be summed up in a sentence. Rank-and-file Conservatives are swinging markedly to the right, and the headquarters of the party is running out of money. The Guardian's main report says that the party of Churchill and Disraeli is flat broke. The Mail's political editor, in his front-page story, says that yesterday Mrs. Margaret Thatcher and her allies gave the Tory bandwagon a sharp shove to the right, and there in its oncoming path was Mr. Edward Heath. The former Tory leader has found himself the target of a relentless move to crush once and for all the lingering hopes of some of his supporters for a new coalition government with him at its head. The Express, commenting on a speech by Sir Keith Joseph, says that in its swing to the right, the Tory party seems ready to adopt the Republican Party's slogan when it nominated Barry Goldwater as its presidential candidate in 1964. In your heart, you know he's right. If the conference continues like this, moderate politicians of all parties will echo the Democratic Party's response. In your guts, you know they're nuts. The Sun, though, thinks it may not be such a bad thing for the Tories to lurch to the right. It could be that people are ready for a change from the old rut of pale pink or pale blue. Several of the papers are expressing concern this morning about the number of doctors leaving the National Health Service. The Telegraph's main report says that at least 300 consultants are preparing to leave Britain for top jobs abroad. In addition, scores of senior registrars, the consultants of the future, have decided to break with the service. The Mail's medical correspondent says that standards of care for cancer patients are now seriously threatened by the growing exodus of doctors from the health service and by critical cash shortage. The Telegraph declares that the doctors are voting with their feet against the ignorant and spiteful predators who control our country. Taxation is vindictively loaded against all talent, diligence, skill, and enterprise. The Guardian says that if the consultants genuinely want to stem the flow of doctors abroad, they should open up their restricted club and allow more senior hospital posts. The health service must be protected. It remains one of Britain's finest post-war achievements, although increasingly shabby at the elbows. The Sun's centre pages have an investigation into what's wrong with the health service. The Express lead story says that doctors have criticised 2 dinners given for health service administrators and their wives at a new hospital. The dinners, costing over £500, were at the Eastbourne General Hospital, which can't be completed because of lack of money. The Times headlines Britain's decision to insist on our own delegation at the proposed International Conference on Energy rather than joining the Common Market delegation. It's taken our partners in the EEC by surprise, says the paper, though the Foreign Secretary is right. We have fundamentally different interests from the rest of the community. Alone among the 9, we shall become at least self-sufficient in oil and possibly an exporter. The Express also thinks we should have no feeling of guilt. Imagine what would have happened if France had found a lot of oil off her coasts and we had suggested she should share it with us. The French would have told us to jump off the Eiffel Tower. The Times has found that a loophole in the Common Market agricultural policy is making huge profits for grain dealers in the Irish Republic, simply by moving barley to and fro across the border with Northern Ireland. Earlier this year, on one day, a lorry crossed the border 3 times with 13 tons of barley, earning a dealer £400 in compensation payments from the EEC. The Mirror exposes not a loophole, but a fiddle in Britain's pubs. According to a survey the paper's carried out, 4 out of 5 pubs overcharge for drinks. And on its front page, the Mirror says the government has declared war on the cheating landlords. From December the 1st, prices of drinks must be displayed in all bars. In one report on its front page, The Guardian notes that there's been no response in the hunt for the kidnapped industrialist in Ireland. In another, it says that British companies are so worried about the spread of international terrorism that they're insuring themselves against the risk of their top executives being kidnapped outside the United Kingdom. Kidnap insurance has been a boom sector at Lloyd's in the past 3 years, and premium payments now bring Britain invisible export earnings of more than £15 million a year. It's an ill wind. Prince Charles's first naval command, the minehunter Bronnington, is pictured cutting through the waves on the front page of the Telegraph. The Sun says he could be in for a rough time. The wooden-hulled vessel is notorious for its handling in bad weather. It's used mainly to seek out old mines left in the North Sea in the last war, but the Prince could also be asked to guard the vital oil and gas rigs. The Mirror says commanding the ship will make Prince Charles 30 pence a day better off, bringing his Navy salary to £4,340 a year. But he gives it all away to charity anyway.
And now, with the latest conquest of Mount Everest still in mind, we bring you the story this morning of Mr. Leslie Hay of Aberdeen. He's just about to set off for his third visit to the Himalayas and will be making for base camp on the world's highest mountain. Mr. Hay happens to be 70 years of age, and Sue Innes asked him why he was climbing Everest again. I would have thought his answer would have been because it's still there, but this is what he said.
The reason I'm going again is that the previous visits have been so enjoyable, and one wants to repeat them as long as one is physically capable of doing so.
But many people would have said that at 70 it's something of a risk to be, and I imagine it's fairly arduous walking up there.
It is not too arduous, provided one keeps one's health. There is always the possibility in these hot countries of getting some upset for health, but with suitable precautions that should be avoided. And subject to that, it's not too bad, provided one takes things slowly at the higher altitudes.
When was the last time you, in fact, did this trek?
The Everest trek I did in November 1972, but I was back in Nepal doing a trek to the Annapurna area in 1974.
Mm-hmm. And do you do any special things to keep fit and to keep in training between treks?
No, I don't do anything special other than my particular mode of life keeps me reasonably fit all the time.
What's that?
I do a great deal of regular walking every day.
Well, now, back here in Blackpool, a lot of the Conservative representatives here spent last night at a Blue Review. But before their wives start telephoning us, let me tell you that this particular review is Tory Blue. It's staged by a group which includes the wife of the Conservative MP for Romford and a former Hammersmith councillor with rather nice legs. They stage half an hour of slightly saucy songs and dances for the entertainment of Conservative audiences and the boosting of Conservative funds. Well, there's a change from the more solemn proceedings here in Blackpool. Here is a flavour of the Blue Review.
Too late, we will tax your estate, VAT on the hearth. VAT on the hearth. If you make a last gift, most of that we will lift, singing all together now. We'll tax you more, yes, much more than before. We will see your taxes more. We'll find a way, we'll find a way. 2, 3, 4. We'll make you pay, and you tax every day. We can always find a way to make you pay, to make you pay.
And yes, the 2, 3, 4 bit was me, and I enjoyed every minute. That's all from the Today programme this morning, and so from the Today team in London and in Blackpool. A very good morning to you.
Today was presented by John Timpson in Blackpool and Desmond Lynam here in London. Radio 4.